to another episode of Sync Riffs. Charles Levan, LA-based sync agent in the Sync Riffs studio with a very special guest. Want to welcome LA-based music supervisor Jordan Young. Good morning, Jordan. How's it going?
I'm doing well, Charles. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for stopping by, and I really appreciate the goal of Sync Riffs. Riff about syncs and the current state of the music biz. And Jordan, you are no stranger to the music biz. You are a award-winning music supervisor for your work. You were nominated for Love Island, and you won the award there. In addition to being a music supervisor, you're also a sync agent. So we're going to unpack some elements and chat about your journey to the music biz. Tell us about your foray into music supervision, but would love to turn the mic to you, Jordan, and talk about some of the pivotal steps in your career that led you to being this powerhouse, not only sync agent but award-winning music soup. You're also a member of the Guild of Music Supervisors and an active member of the Recording Academy, or is it the Television Academy?
Yeah, it's the TV Academy.
But yeah, I'll turn the mic to you, Jordan.
I've been a freelance music supervisor the whole time. But I got my start in the radio side of things. I started in college radio back when I was in college. I'm from Iowa originally, which is a real random place to be from in the middle of nowhere for sure. When you tell people you want to be a music supervisor and you live in Iowa, they look at you like you're crazy after they ask you what is a music supervisor. So it's kind of a long, road and a lot of like linear, steps to get here. But yeah, college radio is kind of the most accessible entry point at that point. I started out being a DJ and then eventually became the station's hip hop director and then the head music director. And while I was there, I was getting pitched a lot of music from different radio promoters and labels and things like that. And that made me realize like, oh, there actually is like a potential career path on the other side of this, being at a radio station as a programmer or a music director or a DJ or whatever is one thing. But then being on the other side of it as a professional, there actually seemed like there was possibly some opportunity there. So that's what I did. I moved to Minneapolis where there was an indie hip hop scene that I was a big fan of. I don't know if you're familiar with, labels like Rhymesayers, artists like Atmosphere or Doomtree or people like that. But that's kind of, I was really into that music at the time and a lot of those labels and artists. So going to Minneapolis and kind of trying to break into that scene is something I was interested in. And there was also a company based there that used to pitch me records when I was in college radio. So I ended up interning with them and then eventually, starting on at the company, taking over their hip hop department. So I started doing hip hop radio promotion there, kind of expanded the department later on to incorporate other genres. So I did some electronic music and a little bit of world music and like a couple jazz albums and other things like that. And, I just call it specialty genre, radio promotion because I just wanted to focus on those genres a bit more. That's always kind of spoken to me more than just the general vibe. And that's always been the case from what I've seen in radio and in sync too. It's like there are a lot of people that want to be like, oh, we want to do a little bit of everything. Like whatever you need, we've got it. We've got this, we've got that. And I'm more like, no, I want to be focused and like pick a couple specific slices and just focus on those because I think you're going to be a lot more effective at being top of mind when someone's in need of something specific. People think about like, oh, I need hip hop. Okay, like let's hit up Jordan, or he's one of the people that are on our short list for that kind of thing. So that's part of why I took that approach. But I started at this company doing radio promotion. I feel like I started to realize pretty well that I was pretty good at it, and a big part of that was because I had come from the other side. I'd worked at a radio station and I'd been in that role. So I know the best way to service someone in that position, and I think that's very beneficial to anyone in this job. You're probably going to be a better music supervisor if you've worked at a publisher or a library or sync agency or something like that and seen what it's like from the other side and vice versa, so I think there's a lot to be said for having experience and insight from the other side to make you better at what you're doing. And that was the case for me, but it went pretty well. I ended up, landing several #1 albums on the hip hop chart at college radio. You know, CMJ was the industry standard at the time. It later became NACC, or NAC as people call it. But you know, because of that, I've got a real soft spot for, you know, college and community and just non-commercial public broadcast stations. You know, there's some great stations here in LA that I still listen to this day, and you
Yeah.
know, I definitely have a big appreciation for that whole scene and that vibe and everything.
Yeah, we share that, Jordan, because I was at Capitol Records in the '90s. Funny enough, I did radio promo as well for a lot of R&B reissues, Al Green, Teddy Pendergrass. But like you said, being in those trenches, and you know, it's boot camp, but you learn fast. And like you said, being both a buyer and a seller of music, and I'll pull up your website in a minute, but you know, you as a sync agent, you know, killing it, working on shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, the list goes on, and Ball in the Family. But what a great time to be working in the biz right now. I mean, I always tell this to folks, you know, back when the famed Tower Records was on Sunset Boulevard, you had House of Blues, you had the Roxy, the Viper Room. And if you were a label rep, you walk in and you saw your priorities on the wall. And now you pull up your Spotify and you're like, I've got 500 records I got to work with, if not more. But what really excites you about, you know, let's talk about you as a supervisor. And I've had past guests. I can only imagine, Jordan, what your inbox is like in any given day. You're managing relationships with sync agents, labels, publishers, artist managers. How do you really compartmentalize being able to, not to mention if you're working on 2, 3 shows at one time, but all your music, cataloging it, and staying on top of that inbox?
Yeah, it's a lot for sure. You get hit up by a lot of people, a lot of inbound messages and things like that, and it's crazy just with the way things are in the industry right now. It feels like there's a lot of really experienced people that have worked at some big company for, you know, several years, or have bounced around between, you know, a couple different majors for their whole career, and now they're leaving to go start their own thing. And now suddenly it's like there's just that many more companies that are starting out. But it's already kind of been that way, just with like even people starting their own company as a means of breaking in the first place. Because that's what I did. You know, I started my own sync agency as a means of developing the credentials and the experience, and finding a way to break in. You know, so it's interesting to see that like even super experienced people are kind of starting to do that now, because you know a lot of companies are having to really like, you know, tighten their bootstraps and, you know, make
Yeah.
things change. And at some point, if you're really experienced, that also means you're more expensive, you know, to keep on the payroll and things like that. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting time. But yeah, just as a result of that, like, yeah, we're seeing an influx of a lot of submissions, a lot of new companies and people like that. And I mean, I honestly probably could and should be much better about like organizing and cataloging music that's sent to me, and just taking something and being like, oh, I don't need this now, but I'm going to tuck this away for a project in the future just in case. I'm not great at doing that, to be honest. A lot of
Mhm.
it is kind of like right place, right time. Like I'm not necessarily going to focus a ton on something if I don't have a need for it at the moment. But
Right.
you do try to keep track of like who has what and where someone has a sweet spot or something like that. You know, I feel like with a lot of the different companies that are out there, they all have different, you know, tiers in terms of, you know, price points and flexibilities, and you know
Mhm.
how quickly they can get things done. But they also have sweet spots in terms of like what's your wheelhouse, you know,
Yeah.
if like if there's a label that focuses on like really great like 70s funk music, like okay, cool, like I'll earmark that for another time. I'm not necessarily going to like take all your music and like set it aside until I need it,
Yeah.
but I will make a note of who you are and what you do.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a big influx of, you know, different, you know, music reps and companies and people that are out there. But we try to take note of that as much as possible. And I think the best thing too is just like build relationships and make a strong impression. You know, it's like I don't really respond much to like cold emails from someone that I've never met or heard of or
Mm.
anything before. But if I've at least heard of you or your company, or if I've met you out at an event or something like that, like I'm gonna take a lot more notice to that.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, I'm just going through your website. Amazing, you know, being able to share your featured artists and one stop rep. You know, when I started way back, Jordan, similarly, and I've been in it for a minute on the sync agency side, but I got a call the other day for they were trying to replace Prodigy's "Smack My Bitch Up," and it was one of those things that it worked to my advantage because like you said, is your brand identity. Folks know me for electronic hip hop as well, singer songwriter, and that go-to list, you're going to reach out to your short list of agents or publishers or labels. And I can only imagine, right, Jordan, if you send out like, hey guys, I need this track by the end of the day, and you reach out to 10 folks and even if they send you 5 tracks, that's 50 cuts you got to listen to. God forbid, what I always, out of respect to you and supervisors, what you guys do, if I don't have something that works, I'll say, hey, thanks, I'll get you next time. I don't want to waste your time listening to 5 cuts that didn't work. And you're like, hey, thanks, Charles, man. That's time. Time is money, and money's time.
Yeah, that's true. There's definitely that component of it, but at the end of the day too, it's like, searching for hidden gems and listening to music is part of the job for sure. So, I mean, obviously we try to like manage that and keep it to a reasonable amount as much as we can, but there's a certain component of that that's like, hey, that's what it is. And I love Prodigy, by the way, so I would definitely be excited to see a brief like that come in for sure.
Right. Yeah. And it's exciting to see because, I'm a huge fan. I geeked out because since Dick Wolf produces FBI, and I know they're going to spin it off to CIA. And of course, he does Chicago PD and that whole the Chicago franchise. But yeah, it's, wanted to spend some time because you are able to wear that hat. Correct. So you were a sync agent first. What was your first music supervision project, and what was that door that opened? Correct. I know you were freelancing. Was it some of the ITV gigs there that landed your foray into the supervision side?
Not really, no. I mean, I that wasn't the case. I guess I'll just kind of pick up where I left off a little bit too. I know we kind of like broke off on the story, so doing radio promotion and everything. At the same time as I was doing that, that's when I started my own sync agency. I was still living in Minneapolis at the time, um, and doing the radio promo stuff through a company, but it was still on a per project basis kind of a thing. So, it gave me flexibility to focus on other stuff and do other things. So, I had these relationships built with a lot of artists and labels that I was pitching for radio. So I
Mm-hmm.
decided, why not try to pitch them for sync too? Because they knew me from working their records at radio and they trusted me, and there was already, a good rapport that was established there. So,
Mm-hmm.
at that point started the road of signing these different artists and trying to connect with music supervisors and pitch them. And after getting a few syncs and actually having some success with it, that's when I decided, okay, it's time to move to LA because that's really where this world lives and that's where this whole industry kind of resides. And I've always wanted to do it in the past, but I felt like I needed to have some groundwork laid before coming out here. Obviously everyone's heard like a million, stories about someone that tries to move to LA and thinks that they're going to start then and that's when they're going to make it. And I'm like, I need to have a little bit more, groundwork laid before I take that leap of faith. So eventually I did, and thankfully it worked out in the long run. But yeah, I came out here and just started pitching music to supervisors like I had been and growing that side of things. But I also wanted to connect with other people to, try to transition to the supervision side of things.
Yeah.
So, that started, I reached out to a bunch of places, even looking for like internships and things like that, because I just wanted to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I was almost 30 years old and I was reaching out for unpaid internships, so it's like, that's kind of how much I wanted to break in and what I was looking to accomplish. But I overall I got a couple of nibbles. Even unpaid internships are hard to get, and especially in California, like you technically are supposed to be a student and receive college credit for it. I think it's like technically not legal to hire someone as an intern and not pay them if they're not getting school credit. So
Mm-hmm.
um, anyway, I ended up doing that. I ended up doing an internship sort of like off the radar, I guess, or whatever, with a music supervisor who does like reality TV and stuff like that. And yeah, it was okay. I learned a couple of things along the way and
Mm-hmm.
picked up a couple of tricks. I got, access to like a suite of music that they use that was used by one of the major networks, and I just kind of got to see some of the grids and cue sheets, and I got to use like rapid cue for the first time and just things like that,
Yeah.
to kind of see how they actually do things and what it looks like. And as much as anything, I think kind of what it showed me, just getting a peek behind the curtain, was like, oh, like I know more about this than I thought, than I knew, than I
Mm-hmm.
realized. Or it's
Mm-hmm.
like I'm closer to being able to do this myself than I thought or than I realized.
Mm-hmm.
So at
Sure.
that point, I was kind of hoping that this internship would lead to actually getting hired, or would lead to another job or something like that, like being hired as a coordinator or something like that. And it didn't happen. And at that point, I was kind of tired of like waiting for someone else to give me an opportunity. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to try to go out and do this by myself. So
Mm-hmm.
at that point, I kind of shifted to try to connect with like indie filmmakers, people that are making projects and need help with the music. So um I ended up booking my first gig on a low budget, micro budget
Sure.
indie horror movie,
Yeah.
and I, as you can imagine, I got paid practically nothing. I had a minuscule music budget to work with, but it was that first leap of faith of going out and doing a project on my own for the first time,
Yeah.
and I ended up licensing some music with this director that was making the project, and I ended up getting my first screen credit, which is I think an important thing when you're starting out, because no one's going to hire you to do a job that you've never done before, at least in
Mm-hmm.
most cases,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's why, these micro budget indie films, or, independent content producers and things like that, like it's it's a good barrier to entry, or it's a good starting point, because like at the end of the day, you just need to find someone that needs help with their music and
Yeah.
convince them to let you help with it. It's not like you have to convince some studio executive to hire you on even though you've never done this before or something like that. So
Yeah.
it's definitely a more accessible barrier to entry, so that was my first job and how it started for me, and it kind of took off from there.
I love, to coin the phrase, chutzpah, like you said, not waiting for the opportunity, creating your own opportunities. Because, like you said, Jordan, is whether you're working on a small indie film work, a documentary, yeah, get your first credit on IMDb, and sort of really cut your teeth at the nitty gritty. Because I think the segue, and if you want to talk about the sheer volume of with reality shows, correct, the number of cues per episode, and some of them can be wall to wall, to talk about. And I'm not fully familiar, and for those tuning in, but tell us, if what you can share, what is rapid cue, and how did that help your job on working with like a reality show?
Sure. I mean, generally speaking, most reality TV shows don't have a composer. They're not actually hiring someone to write bespoke custom music for the project. It's all library music, different, production music, library cues. And it is common for a lot of these shows to have wall to wall music to kind of score the different beats and transitions and
Yeah.
moods and emotions and vibes and everything. And it's not at all uncommon for, a reality TV show that's 60 minutes of schedule, like block programming that ultimately ends up being more like 40 or 45 once you take out ad breaks and things like that. But you know, uh, an episode of TV at that length will frequently have over 100 cues in it, and when that's the case, it's like there is a lot to be accounted for, and it's a high volume for sure. So
Yeah.
um, I mean, that's what those shows tend to look like. And
Mm.
Rapid Queue is a program that's out there just for cue sheet creation and delivery. I mean, there are several of them. There's Rapid Queue and Q Track and Sound Mouse and like a handful of others, and it all depends on what production company and what network is making the show. A lot of the networks have their own like different, delivery requirements and their own infrastructure in place, and they might be like, oh well, we use Sound Mouse, for example, for our shows, so we want you to draft everything through that from the production company. Or some people might be like, oh well, we use Rapid Queue, and we want you to use that because that's what, the infrastructure that we have in place. And
Mm.
there's a whole aspect too about how, like, when you actually do deliver it to the PROs or get it from them, I think that there's some kind of more automated process of them actually ingesting it into their systems and paying out royalties appropriately and things like that. I can't speak as much to that side of it because I don't know, but
Sure.
I assume that the infrastructure and the pipeline of all that is a lot more streamlined. Because when you think about it, it is a really high volume situation where it's like there might be, a production company that's making, a couple dozen different reality shows that all have, again, 100+ cues per cue sheet, and each season of each show has, whatever, like 15, 20,
Yeah.
sometimes more episodes depending on what it is,
Yeah.
so it can be a very high volume, approach, and having, the proper infrastructure in place is an important part of that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Jordan, because now with the proliferation with YouTube, and you'll see artists who will go on and say, "Here's the formula of how I composed a track to create the tension," and they'll say, I got 100 placements in a reality show. So they give the playbook to other artists, and let's talk about you know hip hop artists that we work with and splice or sample packs. There's this misunderstanding. Folks will say, yeah, it's royalty free. I bought this from Splice. I can use it in a song, but that's not the case. If have you seen, you've worked with a ton of hip hop artists, and then together, you and I, where it's like, educating artists, like, hey, you can't sample. If you did sample it, we got to clear the sample. So what are you seeing there with artists using, like, sample packs, and their understanding of the legalities?
Yeah, that's a hot topic for sure. I feel like we could probably talk all day about this and do like several episodes on this topic if we really wanted to dive into it. But yeah, I mean, I'll just say from my own personal experience, like I've heard differing takes from a lot of different, supervisors or other licensees about it, like Splice being the main one that's mentioned. And some people, take the perception that, like, oh, like it's generally fine, and as long as you have the right to use it, it's not an issue. And others, are much more firm about, like, no Splice, not ever, it's not
Right.
something that's acceptable. So there's a spectrum of, different comfort levels that people have, in terms of what's acceptable. Um, I One of the main things that people will say is just generally, like, what's considered a one shot would be okay if it's literally just a snare or a kick or
Mm.
something like that, or a very short sound effect or something. Those are generally deemed acceptable across the board by everyone because there's no underlying composition that's a part of you. You can't copyright one note, right? So when
Right.
that's the case,
Right.
that's not something that's going to be controversial. However, anything that's like a loop or anything that's melodic, definitely anything with vocals in it is always going to be like a much bigger issue for sure.
Yeah.
My take personally is that, like, so I guess when it comes to what we've seen people do a lot of times before is just be really lazy with, like, the flip of a sample. Well, they're basically just drag and drop this splice loop and add a couple, bass and snare kicks behind it and be like, I made a beat. And it's like, you didn't really though. I mean, it's like you have to be a bit more creative with it. And if you're literally just like arranging splice loops, like that's not really going to be a great approach to take for a lot of reasons,
Mm, hmm.
but focusing specifically on problems that can be created by it, there can be a lot of issues in
Yeah.
terms of that. Just, again, we could go into it a lot, but it's not something that would be within my comfort level. That
Sure.
said, I mean, people will sometimes take splice loops and, like, manipulate them significantly to the point
Right.
where I took like 2 seconds of a track and I stretched it out and I reversed it and I ran it through a filter and I chopped it and I did all these things to
Yeah.
make it so it sounds almost completely unidentifiable from where it started. And to me, that's a much safer space to be in with it.
Yeah.
And to my experience and my, take on this is that, like, it's discernment is a huge part of this process. It's not just a black and white thing where it's like splice is okay or it's not. It's like how it's used has a major part in this. There's a lot of gray area
Yeah.
associated with it. So, like, anytime that I would, something like this would come up, I would ask a lot of specific questions about, like, how was this used and what did you do with it? And also, like, you really have to be able to show your work and be like, hey, like, if you said this came from a royalty-free pack, be it Splice or somewhere else, like you have to tell me the source that it came from, tell me the pack that you pulled it from, tell me the title of the sample. Like you need to be very accountable on all this
Yeah.
stuff because I've definitely encountered plenty of artists that are like, oh, I don't remember, or I don't know any of this,
Right.
but it's all royalty free, so don't worry about it. And I'm like, that's definitely not good enough. So
Yeah.
being able to really be accountable for that kind of stuff is really important. And another thing that tends to come up or is an issue with this too, I think, is like, the different opportunities have different varying degrees of what's acceptable. Getting,
Mm,
a sync that maybe has, some degree of a royalty free sample in it in, a low budget indie film or, an unscripted TV show, that's probably going to be a lot less of an issue than if you get, synced in a $50,000 ad,
yeah.
especially because, a lot of times ads will ask for, an exclusive license or at least category exclusivity. And if the main part of your song is a splice loop that could potentially be in a bunch of different songs out there, then you can't really grant exclusivity in a way that's fair or accurate. So, I
Yes.
mean, there are a lot of different nuances around this and a lot of, again, different degrees and different takes on it. But that's my take generally is like,
Yeah.
you have to be very well, this all has to be very well accounted for. And, again, it's a bit of a gray area. And personally, there are a lot of people in the music business that play things really fast and loose. I've seen a lot of things, obviously working with hip hop licensing over the years and stuff like that. And personally, I'm not really much of a risk taker at all. I would definitely rather be safe than sorry. So if there's any degree of uncertainty about any of this stuff or anything seems fishy, I tend to just, stray away from it.
Well said. I mean, a couple points there, and couldn't agree more. But to sort of the gut check, because me as a sync agent, like you said, both of us, if it sounds too good to be true, I'll go back to the artist. And I had a case, which you'll love this story, is I had an artist who sampled some dialogue from the Matrix when Morpheus was talking about take the green pill or the blue pill, and all he did was pitch shift the vocal. And I'm like,
Wow.
I still could discern the sample. And to thread the needle, what you're talking about, but content ID, especially like you were saying, if a song is used in a major car ad, it'll get flagged with content ID if there's a recognizable sample. But it's interesting because to thread it, Jordan, just like if you look back at like say the Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique record, that record would not be able to be made today with all the samples they used, and it's kind of an interesting time because all the dialogue folks talking about artificial intelligence, AI, and then there's like the Deep Fakes Act through the Recording Academy. But I think what can be said is just like when Chat GPT first came out, look at things as a tool. It helps make our lives easier, but don't use it obviously to completely replace the human touch, because we're still going to need that human touch at the end of the day. I don't care how good the AI is, but and that said, Jordan, talking with other sync agents, thinking, have you thought about as well including verbiage, in your agreements with artists, and to let them know, hey, if you create something with AI, be transparent, because I'm sure we're going to start to see that folks sending us tracks, completely AI generated music.
Yeah, definitely. Those are things that we've seen starting to be implemented more and more, and I'm probably beyond the started to at this point. It seems fairly standard for a lot of license agreements and things like that to say like this has to be completely original and AI hasn't been used to generate any part of this. And for good reason. People want to be protected against that kind of stuff. And also, I think there's definitely an aspect too about like if someone's being paid to do a job, they need to actually do it themselves and not just, phone it in and use like AI to do that. And that's not to say that's always the case. Obviously, I think, it's entirely possible for people to use AI as a tool that's not really being used in the creative aspect, but just maybe in more logistical parts of it potentially. But yeah, I mean, I think it's becoming more and more standard for those types of restrictions to be included in license agreements for sure.
Yeah, Yeah, it's as you said, it's sort of the Wild Wild West because I think someone had shared a post on LinkedIn. They were saying, they were sharing a brief with some of their artists, and an artist sent them a cut that wasn't in their wheelhouse. So that was the first clue that the track was generated through AI. And when they vetted the cut, they asked them, and then they admitted that yeah, it was AI. So it was one of those things that trust from, and I think going back to your earlier point, Jordan, of relationship. It's all about the relationships with two gatekeepers, if you will, yourself, music supervisors, and we're beholden, both you and I, to the relationships with the studios, managing their expectations, budgets, and at the end of the day, um, delivering the best possible music, the creative to match the narrative on screen. Um, but want to kind of segue and talk about film, television. Uh, TV's faster than film. You might work on a supervisor film that take 2-3 years depending. But what's the sort of any certain projects out there that you really, or directors or showrunners that you've worked with, and you're like, you had such a great team effort that you hope to work with on more projects? And do you prefer one medium over another?
Yeah, they're both great mediums in my experience. I've always been driven to film and TV a lot more than anything. I mean, as important as it is, and I can see how a lot of people really like doing like ads and trailers and stuff like that. That's just not my wheelhouse so much. I mean, it's a very different medium in terms of storytelling and workflow and things like that. So film and TV are always things I've been driven to. And yeah, they're very different. I mean, I wouldn't say they're necessarily very different from each other, but they can be just depending on the dynamics that are in place. I mean, as anyone will tell you, like every project is different. It's all case by case,
Yeah.
completely across the board, A lot of the films that, I mean, really, just about all of the films that I've worked on are all indies, and there are always a lot of challenges that go along with that. Sometimes working with inexperienced, crew, whether it's editor or producers or directors or whoever, obviously very limited budgets. A lot of times will be an extremely long schedule, or there'll just be no clear end date in sight. And it's like, okay, we're working on this for as long as it takes
Mm,
until it's done. And, the thing about indies is that there isn't like a studio or someone else breathing down their neck to be like, hey, we need to get this delivered, we need to get this out. A lot of times the deadlines that they have are maybe just a film festival that they want to submit to, or
right.
if they do start working with a sales agent or something, that person might say, hey, I suggest that you get it done by this time so we can, because it's a good time of year to try to make a sale based on the genre of the movie or whatever it is. So I
Mhm.
mean, a lot of them are more strategy and suggestions than anything, but worked on several indie films that just have a hard time like getting distributed because it's a tough marketplace out there, and when you're doing it all on your own, there are a lot of challenges that go along with that. But the cool thing about indie films, though, is they get to tell some of the most unique stories, and a lot of times they get to be very open to working with obscure or different music that maybe wouldn't find a place in more mainstream settings and things like that. So
Mhm.
I mean, they both have their own, pros and cons for sure, but they're definitely both mediums that I'm pretty interested in and passionate about.
Now, folks have heard this term many, many, many times, and those in the know. But how do you sort of navigate? And I'm sure it's more commonplace when you're working on a bigger film, but the dreaded temp love, because I so many times I'll see supervisors in chat boards posting, the showrunner found this obscure cut, and we're trying to clear it. We don't know who the rights holders are. But do you have an approach or a tactic to manage an expectation? If they temp in something, you're like, it's going to kill the budget. Obviously, have that conversation way on early and try and provide them some other alternatives, and hopefully they steer away from the temp track.
Yeah, I mean, again, just going back to the fact that it's all case by case, it totally varies on the situation. it's not uncommon at all. I mean, working with, again, like filmmakers that are less experienced, to where they won't even think about music until like the 11th hour of post production. And that's when they start looking at bringing you on, and they're like, oh, we've got, this, our fine cut or rough cut or whatever that's riddled with temp music. And they're like, we want to try to keep as much of this as possible, or actually license as much as possible. And for anything that we can, we want to try to like replace with, similar songs.
Mm,
So at that point, a lot of the creative work is already kind of carved out, and it can be challenging to get people
yeah,
to consider different perspectives, and as much as anything, like detach from those songs. And it can honestly be like a really frustrating process. Some of the time, it's much more ideal for us to
mhm,
get brought in earlier, where we can try to get them attached to songs that are actually within their means,
right,
and to maybe approach different creative directions in the first place. So that's obviously an ideal standpoint, to get involved in a process, in a project. But a big part of this, in terms of managing expectations and everything, and I say
mhm,
this all the time, is that like a big part of our job is of the educational variety. Like, we're
mm,
constantly going around and explaining to, filmmakers or editors or different, whoever, about like how much music costs and why it costs as much as it does, and how,
yeah,
unfortunately, no matter how cool your project is, you're not going to be able to afford this, Beatles song for,
right,
$5,000 or whatever your budget is. Like,
right,
some people have decently realistic expectations going into it, but a lot of people just don't. They just think like, oh, if we can like write a love letter to this artist and tell them how much, this song means to us, or if we just tell them what the budget of the project is, they should quote on a like a per scale, rate. And it's like, yeah, unfortunately, like those kind of negotiations can generally only happen at an arm's length. Like, no
yeah,
matter what, like everyone has to be realistic about this. So there are a lot of conversations that come into play about like, bringing people down to earth, so to speak,
yeah,
and being grounded about what their expectations are. But for me, I try to get excited about going in another direction, and be like, hey, like we're not going to be able to afford these big known copyrights. That's just not realistic. But
mhm,
what I'd love to do is send you some other options of songs that maybe you haven't heard,
right,
or haven't, artists or songs that you haven't heard or heard of before. But if you can approach it with an open mind and listen
yeah,
to some of this stuff, I think you might really get excited about it. And when they start to listen to some things and actually think like, oh, like this is actually something we can get, or this is actually
mhm,
like a realistic,
mhm,
option for us, then that makes it a little bit more enticing to them. But it's, again, it's always an uphill battle. A lot of, musicians are artists, and they can be, have their own struggles and challenges to work with, as I'm sure you know. And
yep,
it can be similar with a lot of filmmakers too. They're very much artists at heart too, and
mhm.
managing those expectations is a pretty big role of the job, for sure. So there's definitely a dance that goes along with it.
Yeah, and what a great time though. Post we had Coachella, Stagecoach, we had the Grammys, but just looking at you know from K-pop to the blend of country that we're seeing, like Shabuzi, and you've got straight ahead country and country that's an amalgamation of other sonic templates. But what what excites you the most right now, as far as I'm sure any given time you can go see a frontline artist getting tickets to the show. So finding that balance between loading up, say, independent artists and frontline artists. Take us through that. Obviously, it comes down to budget. You're managing a budget, and you've got limited spots per episode. But would love kind of the genesis of where do you start when on the creative side, or obviously it's a team effort working with the showrunner. But would love to peel that back, and what does that look like?
Yeah, definitely. There's always conversations that happen with the production team about like what, from the jump, about like what is the musical DNA of this project, or what would you like to see it sound like, or any comparable artists. Or a lot of times they will come in with their own, ideas in mind already, about like, oh, like we'd love to get, this artist or these songs in particular. Again, like the Temp Love thing is very much connected to that. If you can get in early in a more ideal situation, it would be more of an open-ended conversation about like, the sound and the style and the artist and stuff like that, and
Hmm.
kind of take it from there. I mean, personally, I love collaborating with other people on that front. I mean, there have been some situations, this is pretty rare, but occasionally it has happened where someone will actually approach us with like a blank slate and be like, oh, like we don't really know. What do you think it should be? And for me, that's almost harder in some ways. Like I like getting some kind of direction and talking about this stuff and collaborating with someone on it rather than, just being a blank canvas and then going paint me a picture.
Mm,
So to me, I mean, those are the two extremes, right? One being a blank canvas and the other one being like a completely, already temped soundtrack of
right.
replacements or of clearance work. So somewhere in between those two things, I think is definitely ideal. But yeah, it's certainly fun to get to talk through ideas about like, saying, oh, listing certain artists or certain genres or eras or other things like that to
Mm,
talk about different options and then just going down the rabbit hole from there. Everything is different. But in terms of like frontline artists specifically and things like that, that's something coming from my background in like college radio and
mhm.
promotions and everything that I used to do. Like I have a real soft spot for that just because I think it's cool when, artists are generating story and actually doing other things in the industry.
Yeah.
Personally, I'd rather license a song from an artist that's like touring and selling merch and, has an active, fan base on social media and streaming and is actually doing other things, be it radio airplay or press or maybe, syncs or whatever else to like kind of have the whole 360 around it out where they're actually like generating fans and actually have some kind of presence and moving the needle. Like to me, that's
Yeah.
a lot more interesting than just like a composer or producer who made a song in their basement or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's not to like detract from any of those
Sure.
situations either, because there are a lot of people that are making music just for sync now, and that's not to say that it isn't good or that there's not a place for it, but in a lot of cases, like if I have the option to license, an authentic song from a current frontline artist who has fans and is doing all this stuff versus, just a production music song, I'd rather go with the 360 artist, most of the
Yeah.
time. And a lot of what we do too is like it's pitching and sales. It's like we're
Mhm.
selling a song for a spot to a content producer, director, filmmaker, whoever it is. And it's like if you can include these details about how authentic this artist is and how like it serves the story in a much more like robust way, like that's going to be helpful as opposed to just being like, oh, this is a production song that's made by a composer or a production team or whatever it is. So
Yeah.
again, like I've always just been a real sucker for like story and things like that. And I think that again, like authenticity is something that kind of can't be replicated in that same kind of way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Huge points there, and to thread that needle, because talking with certain supervisors, I'll get a different answer. But safe to say, what's the advice if an independent artist cold emails you, and they include a link to their socials, and it dovetails? Say they did their homework, they went to IMDb, so they know that you're working on a show that's shot in New Orleans. You're looking for authentic artists. So if someone says, "Hey, I'm based in NOLA," you'll look at their social media, especially obviously if they've got mad numbers there. Are you one who you'll go down that rabbit hole if you have time, and in addition to listening to music, or how's that work with those links?
Yeah, it's definitely all case by case for
Yeah.
sure. And for me personally, like just having a big following, if you're like, oh, I've got 50,000 followers on Instagram or something, it's like that doesn't mean nearly as much to me as anything else. I mean, in some ways, it might show that you actually do have an authentic following and an authentic fan base. But to me, the difference between having 20,000 followers and 50,000 followers doesn't really matter. It doesn't really make that much of a difference as long as it's enough that you can show that you do have fans, but then looking at the other things that you have going for you, like the fact that you mentioned like being based from a certain like geographic area, that's huge just because a lot of the briefs that I see are specifically for like, oh, we're looking for authentic artists from certain city or state or region or whatever.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
making that known is important. Again, that's something that a lot of production music and things, that's not really a part of the conversation. So yeah, that's big. And I think also highlighting any other accolades that you have along the way, like being able to say like, oh, I've charted on radio. I've been featured in these, big music blogs. I've toured or shared the stage with these other big artists.
Mm-hmm.
Any syncs that you've landed, anything else that you can, again, just to show that you've like been, creating story and building accolades and actually done some things to move the needle. It's like at the end of the day, it's like music is a bandwagon industry, and being able to show that you've done some of these things can look more attractive. And obviously, like, a lot of people say, and I probably should have led with this in the beginning, but the creative is most important first and foremost. It's like something has to be the right fit for the scene and the story and everything going on. These other things are definitely more secondary to that.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, like they definitely are a factor. And if you get the chance to license an authentic frontline artist versus, a production song or something else like that, and they both serve the creative equally.
Yeah.
I think the frontline artist is obviously the better option.
And since you mentioned it, as we look to wrap shortly, I'm sure the bane of your existence, especially if you're working on a show and there's a flashback to an era, let's say the 80s or 90s, and then you send out to your authentic music, ideally released from that era, how those challenges of whether then it comes down to, right, who owns the catalogs to an 80s or a 90s, and if your search comes back netting zero, I've seen briefs where folks and supervisors will say, okay, now we're gonna lax it, inspired by the 80s, because right, that could be a challenge if you want to talk, Jordan, about that, having those authentic pieces of music that were released in that era. What are you seeing there when it comes to the creative needs for period tracks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a situation where you would want to rely on your contacts and your music licensor friends and people that can help you navigate that. Kind of like to circle back to the beginning of the conversation, talking about different companies having their sweet spots and things like that. That's where it's great to know, where some of these bodies are buried. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
actually knowing like, oh, there's this great indie record label from the 90s that would make great alt rock music or whatever the
Mhm.
genre or the needs are. Knowing them or knowing the sync agents or whatever other company might represent their rights,
Yeah.
it's really helpful, and it's good to know. And yeah, I mean, I've definitely you've seen that be scaled back along the way based off of budgets and things like that, where they're like, oh, we want well-known, authentic '90s hits, and then they find out how much it is, and they're like, well, actually, how about just authentic '90s songs? Okay, well, how about just '90s sounding songs? And like, it can definitely like get scaled down along the way when people realize how much music costs or the challenges associated with it or whatever. But obviously, the goal there is to strive for authenticity as much as possible and get as close to the mark as you can. But I think there's an area there that a lot of filmmakers don't necessarily see or miss out on, because
Hmm.
a lot of times, especially working on lower budget indie films and stuff like that, is people tend to approach it, or if they think they only have a few options in terms of music. They'll be like, okay, we can hire a composer to score the entire thing, and that'll be all of the music.
Mhm.
We can use some like cheap like royalty free like music libraries where you can get a blanket license for a few $100s online or something, and obviously those have a lot of their own issues for various reasons.
Mhm.
Or they think like, oh, big commercial songs that are like big well-known hits that are all controlled by major labels and publishers, that are super expensive. And if they know they know that those things are generally not going to be within their means.
Yeah.
Or maybe they don't know and they just think like, oh, we'll try to go after those for whatever reason. But a lot of times they don't think of like a middle option, which is like, hey, you could hire someone who has a working knowledge of the landscape and the music business, and who can cue you into like more hidden gems or indie artists, or
Right.
lesser known songs that were never hits but are maybe still authentic to a certain genre or era or something like that. And again, you can find songs that maybe you've never heard or artists you've never heard of, but still have really good music that can be a good fit for the project and
Yeah.
actually are going to be within your means. So I feel like if there's any area of like education or knowledge or anything like that with different filmmakers or content producers, that's the one that I would definitely want to hone in on as much as anything. It's like, hey, there is this other option where you can actually get real, authentic, good music. You just have to be open minded enough to to consider songs and artists that you're not familiar with yet.
Yeah, and kudos because it's to thread it, Jordan. That touch point when you license a track from maybe sometimes it might be the estate of an artist who passed away years ago. What it means to the estate and the family, giving new life to that song from an indie artist, and yeah, it's rare to really see a supervisor who you excel at both sides on the pitching side and as a supervisor. And congrats on the GMS award. I know a lot more in store for you as the year goes on, but always like to end with a fun. Any particular cuts or artists that are on repeat on your streaming device, or are you old school? Do you have I got some Al Green vinyl behind me. Uh, Anything that you're jamming for the weekend, or when you're downtown and you want to relax and not listen to music for work? What's popping in the playlist?
Yeah, great question. I feel like we don't get asked that often enough. Although it's hard to say and narrow it down. I guess I'll give a shout out to this is probably my favorite album that's come out in 2025 so far. It's a couple months old by now, but it's the latest album by Clipping. It's called Dead Channel Sky. If you're familiar with Clipping at all, they're this like experimental, like alternative hip hop group that mixes these like crazy synthetic beats over like hard rapping and stuff.
Oh,
The album's out on Sub Pop Records. I just went to the album release show at the Echo a couple months ago, actually. But yeah, I've been a fan of theirs for a long time, and this new album is pretty rad. There's a cool story behind it where it's sort of influenced by like cyberpunk and stuff like that. So that's like I said, it's my favorite album of 2025 so far. So that's
nice.
definitely one I've been rocking with a lot lately.
And how do you spell the artist name again?
So it's pronounced clipping, and it's just spelled clipping, Clipping, and then there's a period after it.
Okay,
So
cool.
like clipping period, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's dope, man. And dude, Sub Pop, man, everything they put out, very nice. Just pulling up their, making sure, and
Yeah.
I'll post this. Wow, so that cut, nothing is safe.
Yeah, I actually got turned on to them back in the college radio days, actually. I mean, so Pop would promote a lot of their albums out to college radio. So, I mean, they don't work with a ton of hip hop music. So when they did, they had a couple hip hop artists over the years, like Clipping or Shabazz Palaces, or like maybe one or two others. And that definitely kind of got it on my radar. And, that was
Mm.
several years ago, and I'm still listening to them now. So that was always kind of one of my pitches in college radio is like, hey, it's a way to make a strong impression on people that might go on to work in the industry later or who currently do work in the industry and other facets or things like that. So, it never fails to be a cool, source for music discovery for sure.
No, man, that is kudos. Because similarly, I was a mobile DJ in college, but I think that is for a lot of us. And I had Burt Bacharach on. Music saved his life, as he would say. Music saved all of our lives, and what would we do without it? I think being a DJ and that passion, the fire in our belly every day. What excites me as a sync agent is like working with yourself, supervisors, being able to share like who is the next big artist that we haven't heard of, and is blending styles. And it's that feeling of being a DJ, and whether you're playing at a radio station or playing live, and seeing the reaction on the listeners' faces of like, what is this piece of music? But thank you, Jordan, for sharing that about clipping. That is too cool. And man, I really appreciate your taking the time out. And we will post a link through to your socials, and so folks can stay in touch and look forward. We got the Guild of Music Supervisors conference in August. Shout out to the GMS, and make sure folks listening in. If you're not a friend in the guild, hop online. Great way to connect with supervisors, sync agents, and the community. Thanks so much for taking the time out.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Charles. I really appreciate it.
Likewise, and until then, catch you on the other side. Namaste.
Cheers.
Go.